Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the Rules Committee met and reported a rule, H.R. 145, providing for consideration of H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019, and H.R. 1112, the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2019. The rule provides for consideration of each bill under a structured rule. The rule also provides 1 hour of general debate on each bill, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. The Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019 and the Enhanced Background Check Act of 2019 arrive at a time of emergency for America, a real emergency. Every year, 120,000 Americans are shot in our country, and 35,000 of them are shot dead. 17,000 of the people wounded or killed each year are children or teenagers, their families devastated, their lives forever changed. In 2017, gun deaths in America hit the highest level in 40 years, with 40,000 Americans killed. We've lost more Americans to gun violence in our own communities than to the Vietnam War, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Iraq War, the Afghan War combined. And this war at home never stops. Each day, yesterday, today, tomorrow, another 100 people in America are shot and killed by gun violence. Mr. Speaker, this is not a global problem. It's an American problem. While 35,000 Americans are killed by gunfire here each year, it's 146 people in the United Kingdom, 142 in Portugal, 30 in Japan. We lose more people to gun violence in a single weekend than England loses all year. We lost more people in the Las Vegas massacre alone in one bloody night than the nation of Japan lost to gun violence in 8 years. No other developed high-income country's lethal gun violence even comes close to the American carnage allowed by our loophole-ridden gun laws. The gun-related murder rate in the United States is 25 times higher than the average of other high-income countries and hundreds of times higher than some of them. Now, the good news is that we know what to do to begin to end this crisis. We must close the loopholes. In 1994, the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act went into effect and required licensed firearm dealers to contact the FBI to run a background check through the NICS system, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. The Brady Act made it illegal to sell a firearm to felons, to fugitives, to people who've been committed to mental institutions, to drug addicts, to domestic abusers, to undocumented immigrants, and to other disqualified categories. The Brady Act worked as far as it went. It has stopped more than 3 million illegal purchases of firearms by convicted felons, violently abusive fugitives, the mentally ill, and so on. But there are gaping loopholes in the law because unlicensed gun sellers, the people who sell guns online today or at gun shows or in other private transactions, can sell firearms without having to run any background check whatsoever. More than 1/5 of U.S. gun owners acquired their most recent firearm without any background check at all, which means that millions of people obtain millions of firearms without going through the Brady system. And people who commit gun crimes overwhelmingly obtain their firearms from the unlicensed sources. A 2013 study found that 80% of all firearms acquired for criminal purposes were obtained from sources that were not required to go through the background check. The criminals are not stupid. They follow the loopholes. They go to the internet. They go to the gun shows. They go to the convenience store parking lots to get their weapons of mass destruction without any background check at all. Our legislation will close these dangerous loopholes by guaranteeing that there's a thorough NICS background check on every gun sale or transfer, with only a few carefully defined exceptions for intra-family gifts and a few other cases. There are 3 primary things you need to know about this legislation. 1, it is backed by more than 90% of the American people. Fully 97% of Americans, including 97% of gun owners, 97% of Republicans, 99% of Democrats. It is the very essence of common sense, the sense we all have in common, to make the background check system comprehensive and universal, leak-proof, foolproof, not ridden by the loopholes. A background check doesn't work if criminals know that there are massive and lawful ways to cheat and get around it. So America today stands up to close the loopholes. And that is why this is a day of great triumph for the gun safety movement that has swept America in response to Parkland and Las Vegas and Newtown and the other massacres that our people have endured. Second, this legislation is perfectly constitutional. As Justice Scalia found for the Supreme Court in the D.C. versus Heller decision, the Second Amendment permits reasonable regulation to exclude from gun ownership violent felons, the mentally unstable, and so on. Despite all of the solemn invocations of the Second Amendment that we continue to hear bouncing off of the walls of Congress, the opponents of this legislation could not muster a single witness to actually argue that this legislation is unconstitutional. And that includes the George Mason University Antonin Scalia School of Law professor of constitutional law and the Second Amendment, who was brought in and just expressed her policy misgivings about the bill without articulating any constitutional analysis at all, and rejected the opportunity to say that this legislation is unconstitutional. The reason 97% of Americans favor this legislation is because it is perfectly consistent with the letter and spirit of the Second Amendment, and it sweepingly advances public safety at the same time. This bill finally will dramatically lower gun violence in America. More than 90% of Brady background checks take less than 90 seconds to complete. But these checks have literally stopped more than 3 million illegal gun purchases by felons and fugitives and domestic offenders, the violently mentally ill, undocumented aliens, and so on. Every day, background checks stop 170 felons and 50 domestic abusers from purchasing a gun. Imagine how much more effective this system will be when we close these gaping loopholes. And yet, even in the face of the shocking death toll, which distinguishes our society from the other wealthy societies on earth, despite the overwhelming public support for this legislation, and despite its clear constitutionality, our friends across the aisle oppose closing the internet, the gun show, and the private sale loopholes. Instead of getting on our side to close the loopholes, what do they give us? More loopholes. They brought us dozens of amendments to try to suggest more loopholes to the current law. That's obviously not the direction that America needs to go in, and you'll hear some more about that today. They have given us a veritable loophole factory, but now is the time to close loopholes, not reproduce them. Let's focus on the public safety, which is the cardinal purpose of law and the social contract in a democratic society. Let's pass this excellent bill, and let's pass H.R. 1112, the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2019, which closes the Charleston loophole, the loophole that made it possible for a guy to go out and get a gun because the dealer decided to give him a gun after 3 days because they were still doing a background check. And this loophole says if it's taken 3 days or more, then you have a right to go ahead and get your gun. We're going to close that one, this so-called default proceed provision. We're going to close that one too, so that we don't see any repeat massacres like the one that took place in June of 2015 at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. I will, at this point, reserve the balance of my time. Mr.